Good morning, you're watching Addis News Hour. I'm Zoltan Desalegn with the news. Thank you for joining us and do stay tuned. With the details of the landmark peace agreement signed in Pretoria, South Africa last week being worked out in Nairobi, Kenya, an economist expressed hopes that the much desired calm would help foreign and domestic investors regain confidence to operate in Ethiopia. Talking to ETV English, the renowned economist Zamadine Nigatu said Ethiopia's ambitious plan of wheat export will reap dividends in the post-war period. Zamadine Nigatu, global chair of Fairfax Africa, expressed confidence that GDP growth will most likely touch the 10% mark by 2030. Gosha Meliso has compiled the following account. Take a look.
The federal government of Ethiopia and TPLF have signed peace agreement unprecedentedly under the auspices of the African Union in Pretoria, South Africa. The peace agreement helping millions of Ethiopians feel hopeful and refreshing.
Thank you, sir.
Commenting on the matter, an economist, Zamadine Nigatu, said foreign and domestic investors regain confidence to do business in Ethiopia.
Everything else becomes detail. So last week, when the announcement was made, and actually we watched it live as the agreement was being signed, there was a very early indication that investors are starting to regain confidence in the Ethiopian economy, which has been, affected for the last 2 years. I'll give you a very simple example. Ethiopia has about 9 years ago, issued what's called a Eurobond, a $1 billion Eurobond, which will be maturing this 2023. For the last year, maybe a year and a half, the bonds were trading significantly below their par value. That means investors were having concerns about the economy. The day the agreement was signed, the price of the Eurobonds went up.
Zamadine noted that after the peace deal signed, IMF has reached a staff-level agreement to release $2.9 billion finance package to Ethiopia.
You've seen in the headlines, the IMF is now re-engaging with Ethiopia.
Yeah.
As you know, the IMF, the World Bank, has suspended financing of billions of dollars, which has already been approved a couple of years ago, more than 2 years ago, but they're suspended during the conflict. Now, those are positive initiatives. I know it's early days, but you can multiply that by over the course of the next few months or next few years, when very significant foreign currency comes into the country for the productive sector, also for rebuilding what was destructed last year. Ambassador Redwan actually quoted a figure, which he said Ethiopia needs $20 billion to rebuild what was damaged. So there's a very significant, what I call peace dividend, that comes out of this agreement last week.
The economist further adding that Ethiopia's grand initiative of wheat production will make the nation the leading wheat exporter in the East Africa region.
We go from an importer, imagine, to very soon, there was news headlines and discussions by others, very soon Ethiopia will be a net exporter of wheat.
Yeah.
By the way, that's just one example. There are a lot of, for example, the agriculture sector, we see lately very significant investments in mechanized farming. When that starts happening in large scale over the next year or two, it's not inconceivable for Ethiopia to be actually a large scale agriculture exporter, one. Second, a value addition type of agriculture, converting coffee to, processed coffee. And so it really has a very significant meaning to have this peace.
Zamadine disclosed that resources which were deployed for war will be redeployed to the other development sectors to accelerate the economy.
But for us as Ethiopians, as a country, to have peace means economic progress will accelerate. Resources that were being deployed for the conflict will now be redeployed to the productive sector of the economy. That means it increases employment, it increases manufacturing, agriculture, all the sectors that we can think of, which are part of the economy, the service sector, will now have more resources to invest, which means more people will get jobs.
Scholars say the dramatic diplomatic breakthrough at Pretoria, South Africa, that will put an end to 2 years of one of the bloodiest wars is an exemplary contribution to the fruition of the African Union's principle that Africans should solve its problems by its own. The permanent cessation of hostilities secured in South Africa between combatants and African mediators from the AU is a clear manifestation that Africa is perfectly capable of finding remedies to its problems without any interference from foreign powers. Johannes Fontaine has the details. Take a look.
Many agree that the peace agreement reached in Ethiopia is a demonstration of the implementation of the African Union's principle of African solutions to African problems. For many centuries, Ethiopia has been resisting the Western interference in the continent. Tesfaye Molla, a senior researcher at the Institute of Foreign Affairs, said Ethiopia strongly believes problems in Africa should be solved only by Africans. As an example, the scholar mentioned Ethiopia's effort to bring peace to Sudan, Somalia, and other African countries.
From 1974 to 1978, Ethiopia played a role in negotiating the Biafra conflict in Nigeria. In addition, in 1972, it mediated the conflict between North Sudan and South Sudan rebels in Addis Ababa. In recent times, the country has been playing an important role in bringing peace to Sudan, Somalia, and other areas in the continent.
The researcher who says that Ethiopia had made a great effort to resolve the war in the northern part of the country in a peaceful way, the agreement reached by the African Union brokered has confirmed its unwavering position for peace.
Initially, it should be recognized that Africans have their values to solve their problems. This was demonstrated by solving a problem in Ethiopia too. This shows that if Africans are free from interference and have the opportunity to solve their problems in their way, they have shown that they can solve other complex problems like what happened in Ethiopia.
The initiative of African Solutions for African Problems was born out of a strong desire to revive a marginalized and exploited continent that has been undermined by centuries of slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, exploitation, oppression, war, and hunger. There is also a growing consensus amongst analysts, policymakers, academics, and civil society representatives on the continent that continental integration is a remedy for African problems.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that talks being held in Nairobi between the military leaders of the Ethiopian government and those of the TPLF will pave the way for the restoration of basic services in Tigray and the resumption of access to humanitarian aid in Tigray. This came here the previous day when the ministry briefed local and foreign journalists on current affairs. We have the following report on that. Take a look.
Following the peace agreement reached between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF in Pretoria, South Africa, the generals of Ethiopian Defense Forces and the TPLF are holding talks in Nairobi, Kenya, starting Monday. According to the peace agreement, their meeting is a good start. The spokesperson reiterated their discussion, said the spokesperson will pave the way for the continuation of humanitarian and community services in the Tigray region.
Following the peace agreement signed in Pretoria, South Africa, generals of Ethiopian Defense Forces and the TPLF are discussing the peace talks in Nairobi, Kenya. It is expected to be completed today or tomorrow. This discussion between the two parties will pave the way for further steps to make humanitarian and social services accessible in various areas.
The spokesperson also called on diasporas and media houses to stop division and refrain from preaching divisive outlets and hatred and focus on the benefits of peace agreement respectively. According to Melese, the peace agreement has opened a new chapter and said that efforts should be made to implement it. The ambassador noted that various countries and organizations as well as financial institutions have sent out messages that show that they will accept the peace agreement and provide the necessary support for its implementation. The spokesperson also stated that friends and partners of Ethiopia conveyed their message about making the efforts to rebuild the communities affected by the war and resettle the displaced and return militants to lead peaceful life.
ሰላም ሁኔታ በተመለከተ የሀገራችን ህዝብ ከዳር እስከ ዳር የደገፈው ነው።
Regarding the peace settlement in Ethiopia, from every corner has showed their support. The international community also highly welcomed the peace agreement. Various countries and international organizations as well as financial institutions and influential individuals have sent out messages that show that they will accept the agreement and provide the necessary support for its implementation. And Ethiopian government massively appreciates and is also grateful for this. Friends and partners of Ethiopian conveyed to make the efforts to rebuild the communities affected by the war and resettle the displaced and return the militants to a peaceful life, which this can be taken as great news.
የሚደረገውን ጥረት እንደግፋለን የሚል ማረጋገጫ ሰጥተዋል። ይሄም በጎ ዜና ተደርጎ የሚወሰድ ነው።
The Tigray Democratic Party has expressed readiness to play constructive role for the implementation of the recently signed peace agreement between the Ethiopian government and TPLF to end 2 years of hostilities. In a statement it issued on Wednesday, the TDP said that the agreement is pivotal in ensuring lasting peace in Ethiopia and strengthening unity among Ethiopians. The peace dividend for all Ethiopians is significant, the statement noted, adding that the TDP, as one of the major actors in Tigray, will do its level best for the smooth, speedy, and systematic implementation of the agreement. Research findings show that African countries, which are the least responsible for the negative impacts of global climate crisis, face seeing their GDP growth rate fall by up to 64% by the end of the century. The finding made it to the floor of the COP27 summit at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, igniting hot debates. Take a look.
As world leaders discussed climate action at the UN summit in Egypt, a study commissioned by Christian Aid has found that burning fossil fuels at the current rates will have a huge impact on the finances of African countries. The average hit to GDP per capita could be as much as 34%, finds the report, while the effect on GDP growth will lead to an average 20% reduction in rates by 2050 and a huge 64% on average by 2100. The findings underscore the urgent need for tangible progress on climate finance for adaptation and loss and damage, key areas on which developing nations will push richer polluting countries. As COP27 discusses climate finance, report says continent's GDP growth could fall by 2/3 at the end of this century.
The most valuable contribution that the developed countries can make is to reduce their emissions faster, while investing with Africa to build sustainable green power.
The 54 countries of Africa account for 15% of the world's population, but contribute less than 4% of the CO2 heating the planet, in contrast to 27% from China, 15% from the US, and 17% from the EU. But Africa is the continent most affected by catastrophic climatic changes, such as rising sea level and melting glaciers, as well as increasingly erratic and destructive extreme weather events, such as droughts, wildfires, floods, and heat waves. The study analyzed the estimated GDP growth for 50 African countries if there was no global heating, compared with the best and worst case scenarios of 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2.4 degrees centigrade by 2100. Under current climate policies, the GDP growth of 8 countries, Sudan, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, Djibouti, and Nigeria could be reached by as much as 75%. Sudan, where this year heavy rains and flash floods affected more than 250,000 people in 15 out of 18 provinces, economic growth could be hit by a staggering 84% under global climate policies. The study did not factor in new climate adaptation measures, so the GDP downside could be less severe. But nor does it take into account the economic damage caused by extreme weather, so the downslide could be conceivably even even worse. So far this year, more than 200,000 homes have been destroyed by floods and landslides in Nigeria, while 37 million people face starvation after 4 consecutive droughts in the Horn of Africa. A UN report published last week found that international adaptation finance is 5 to 10 times below what developing countries actually need, and the gap is widening every year. What can you say about the general culture of Ethiopia in terms of resolving conflicts on a large scale?
Grounding it in a local context.
We're talking about building trust and moving past conflict.
The trust has to be built on transparency and truth.
How do you think the process has impacted us?
The drought and the displacement. So one thing is that needs to be stabilized.
Speaking about a larger scale of conflict and resolving that.
The AU being, emboldening itself to fully embrace.
What do you think the international community can do?
Let's tone it down. Let's just let it happen.
What can you say about the general culture of Ethiopia in terms of resolving conflicts on a large scale?
Grounding it in a local context.
We're talking about building trust and moving past conflict.
The trust has to be built on transparency and truth.
How do you think the process has impacted us?
The drought and the displacement. So one thing is that needs to be stabilized.
Speaking about a larger scale of conflict and resolving that.
The AU being, emboldening itself to fully embrace.
What do you think the international community can do?
Let's tone it down. Let's just let it happen.
You're watching Addis News Hour, and we have arrived at the segment of What's Trending as I'm joined by our staff member, Daniel Kasan. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Well, as we have to cast forward to what's been trending over the past 24 hours, as we all know, I think, let's talk about the COP27 Climate Change Conference summit that actually happened at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, which also ravels around taking responsibilities in the fight against climate change. And I think you have the nutshell general points of what you need to cast forward to, I think.
Yeah, we are hearing lots of cries from leaders of the world in the COP27 meeting, which is still happening. It's happening in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. It's disappointing that there was a promise made in Copenhagen 12 years back to compensate African countries, not only African countries, but developing countries in order to have adaptation mechanism in order to withstand the adverse effects of climate change. 12 years have passed. Still now, the promise is on air. They haven't made it real, and African countries are not getting the promised finance in order to help the people to withstand the adverse effects of climate change. Many of the leaders of the continent and other leaders of developing nations are mentioning this year after year. Whenever the climate change conference happens, this issue is always active. Still now, after 12 years, the issue is active. They are begging for financing. Please help, please help, please help. But their cries haven't got ear from the developing nations. African countries are feeling the pinch. Now, not only African countries, developing nations, but all of the world are feeling the pinch of climate change. Last time we had the wildfire in a single country, in Spain. At the same time, there were over 200 or 300 fires here and there. Americans, they have felt the pinch. Lots of wildfires have ravaged many of the developing nations. Now they are feeling it. Floods everywhere. So these two, especially the wildfire and the flooding, already it tells you that time is running out. And governments are not doing the right thing in order to live in harmony with nature. But what's Ethiopia doing at this time? We have to mention the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Ethiopia is harnessing all its renewable sources. The wind farm, the geothermal, the solar, and the hydropowers being built in this country are prudent examples in order to withstand the adverse effects of climate change. And the Green Development Initiative, which has been run for the past 4 years. How many seedlings Ethiopia has planted? Around 25 billion seedlings. Leaders have to shift and have to take responsibility, and they have to do their level best in order to withstand the adverse effects of climate change. Begging for money from developing nations, it doesn't work. They don't want to give the money for the developing nations. They don't care about Africans. They don't give. Africans are feeling the worst, especially in East Africa. Some countries are in famine status. Famine is ravaging the continent. So it's better for Africans, developing nations to follow Ethiopian way. Ethiopian way is the right way in order to tackle the adverse effects of climate change. That's what can I have.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel Kassaun, for actually briefing us of what's been trending so far. Thank you.
Thank you. The destructive war in the northern part of Ethiopia comes to an end with an agreement signed in Pretoria, South Africa. Amidst of this adverse situation, Ethiopia's economic development endeavors are proved resilient, of which is the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is nearing completion. For more of God-related issues and other current matters of the country, watch us on Addis News Hour of ETV Language Channel.
The 2022 Ethiopian Great Run will take place this November. ETV English is provide live reporting, exclusive interview, sport assortments, and other related activities in the competition. We are also ready to make a report to show the significance of Ethiopian Great Run in cementing or boosting the sport diplomacy of Ethiopia.
The National Bank of Ethiopia announced activities are underway to resume bank services in areas of northern Ethiopia ravaged by the 2-year-long war. Talking to ETV, Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Ethiopia, Solomon Desta, said efforts are being exerted for the restoration of banking services in these areas as soon as possible.
አገልግሎት ስለማስጀመር እንድናወራም ስለበቃን ለዚህ ስለደረስን
First of all, I would like to praise God for His glory, enabling us to talk about the situation of the bank infrastructure to be resumed in war-affected areas. Various parties had paid sacrifice for the war. I also thank them for their efforts. In general, I would like to thank the people of Ethiopia and congratulations them on the peace agreement. And hereby, I should inform you that there were preparations before the war that we had been undertaking on behalf of the National Bank of Ethiopia and other banks. With the board and the management of the banks, some individuals follow up on the opening of banks in various areas. However, according to the National Bank of Ethiopia, Ethiopia. There's a great interest to immediately resume the services because the people ought to benefit from this service and to enable the sector safe and more productive.
According to the Deputy Governor, the activities include re-equipping facilities, furniture resulting from the vandalization during the brutal war that resulted in the death of over 500,000 people and the destruction of billions of dollars. Take a listen.
በመጀመሪያ ደረጃ ኢትዮ ቴሌኮም ቀደም ብሎ ነው ፎርዋርድ ሉኪንግ ሆኖ እየሰራ እንደሆነ እናያለን። ልክ እንደ ፓወር
Ethio Telecom and Ethiopian Electric Utility are forward-looking institutions to deliver services in various areas. We are forming national task force to deliver basic services in the northern parts of the country. We are also working along with other institutions to safeguard financial institutions.
The National Committee for the Repatriation of Citizens from Saudi Arabia and other countries announced that the repatriation of citizens from Saudi Arabia will resume in 2 weeks. During the discussion, State Minister for Foreign Affairs and head of the National Committee, Burtkhan Ayyan, reaffirmed the government's unwavering commitment for the speedy and smooth repatriation of its citizens. The State Minister pointed out that provisional shelters for repatriates have already been put in place. She also underlined the need for federal and regional organs assigned to the mission work in a concerted manner to achieve national targets set by the National Committee. The previous round of repatriation has achieved 70% of its target by repatriating 71,697 citizens that took a total of 198 flights. The target was to repatriate 102,000 citizens from Saudi Arabia. Preparations will be resumed over the coming 2 weeks to repatriate the remaining 30,303 citizens.